Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Method Ministries. I'm your host, Lucas Curcio, and I'm here with author Jeremy Carl, and he wrote an awesome book called The Unprotected Class: How Anti-White Racism is Tearing America Apart. So great title, and welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Lucas. It's a pleasure to be on.
Yeah, definitely. So originally, I just heard that your title was going to originally be "It's Okay to Be White," and that got changed. What happened there?
Yeah, so let me give you a little bit of a background on me, just so that your listeners will know before I kind of get into that. So I'm a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute. We're a public policy think tank based out of California, but I work out of my home in Montana. Prior to that, I was at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University for a decade, kind of doing similar sorts of public policy type work, mostly actually in other fields. Slightly, and it was really this was kind of an avocation that became a vocation. So uh, as that happened, kind of my mission moved a little bit. Final thing that I think would maybe be notable is I served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Interior under President Trump and oversaw a 10,000 person bureaucracy there. So kind of have been in the trenches with government work and advising politicians, as well as sort of doing the things that I'm doing right now. But about the specific book title, so I'd originally, we'd had a number of titles that we kicked around, and none of them we loved. But I really hit on this kind of idea to call it "It's Okay to Be White," and I actually got my editors enthusiastic about that book title. And then ultimately the sales staff killed it. They came back and said, this was like 2 months after we'd agreed this was the title, we're going forward. They said, hey, we can't sell that title into Costco and Walmart. And I thought that in and of itself was so revealing about where we are in this cultural moment. Because look, of course it's okay to be Hispanic, it's okay to be Asian American, it's okay to be Black, et cetera, et cetera. And if I said any of those things to you, I think these would be unremarkable. But if you say it's okay to be white, I might as well just put on my KKK hood. And I think it really just shows something very kind of shocking, or maybe not so shocking, about the kind of moment that we're in.
Yeah, how ironic that as you said, like you write a book about that, and as you get it published, you come across these same problems that the title says.
Yeah.
And
Oh, I absolutely. And just even I've been really blessed by the Lord that actually I've gotten a number of really important folks, particularly on the right, to interview me, et cetera, et cetera. But even just with the release of the book in a million different ways, there are a lot of people who are like, "Wow, I love that subject," but I don't know that we can get this by our editors. I literally had a situation. I have to be a little bit vague here, but I'm sure your listeners
yeah,
can figure it out, where I had two major hosts of a major show on a major conservative broadcast network kind of be very enthusiastic about getting me on and like ask my phone number so we could. Didn't happen.
did not
So
happen.
I think
Wow.
it just kind of shows some of the challenges that are out there in having a serious conversation about this issue. And my book is
Yeah.
not inflammatory in any way. It's a serious book.
Well, and your book is really just talking, about what's been going on, especially in the last 4 years, like as we saw in 2020. Like I went to a couple of Acts 29 churches, and this
Mm,
issue of just discriminating towards white people, like going back to the George Floyd, every black person was George Floyd, and every white person was an officer on his neck. And if you're
right,
a white man, you're in this category. If you're a black person, you're in this category. So like I'm
right.
really happy that you're trying to expose this and what's going on.
Yeah, no, and this is not kind of my sub expertise, but Acts 29 makes an appearance in the book. So does the
Mm.
Gospel Coalition, it's
Oh
Christianity
boy.
Today, et cetera. In my chapter when I talk about the church, and it's exactly like there's a book that really kind of heavily informed my chapter of the church on the church was Fault Lines by Vodi Bakum. I don't know if you're
Oh
familiar with it.
yes.
Yeah, and that was really terrific. And I have to tell you, because I'm not as versed in these matters and kind of how they played out within the church, I embarrassingly had not even heard of him at the time. We had the same publisher,
Hmm.
and my publisher gave me a copy of his book and said, "Hey, this book sold really well and you might find it interesting and relevant. And, I got to be honest, like my view is like, okay, it's going to be the non-woke black guy who kind of like tells me how it's great to be non-woke. And I mean, that's great. I'm glad there are people out there doing that, but I didn't have any grand expectations for that book coming in. But actually, theologically, as you know, if you've read it, I mean, it's a real tour de force in terms of really interrogating and convicting a lot of this, what's going on is just totally unbiblical, the antithesis of Christianity, not compatible with Christianity, these sorts of things that are going on in the church. I mean, the idea is, that we're somehow guilty because of the color of our sin. And as Bauckham points out, of course, we're all guilty. We're all judged.
Yeah.
It doesn't have anything to do with what color skin we are. And to kind of think that we have victim and oppressor classes based on that is a dangerous and unbiblical notion.
Now, in your book, so I listened to some podcasts, that you did previously, and you're careful to highlight that it's not written from a polemic, point of view, but more so like a data point of view. So you want to present the facts that, hey, white people is a major thesis, like white people right now are currently the number one ethnic group who are being discriminated racially.
Right. Yeah. And I felt like there's a phrase sometimes used in the law, res ipsa loquitur, that means the thing in and of itself speaks.
Yeah.
Means you kind of don't have to add a bunch of things to it, or it doesn't need to be a character examination of whether you think I'm personally a wonderful person or not. And that's what I really tried to do here. I mean, when you have, they talk about among lawyers, if you have the facts, pound the facts. If you have the law, pound the law. If you don't have either, pound the table. I didn't see any need to pound the table here because I felt like I had the facts and at least some of the law. I mean, I think we need to fix a lot of the law, unfortunately, really on my side. And so it was just, I think, actually one of the best things we did in this book, which with my editors, it wasn't a particularly polemical book even to begin with. But through the editing process, if there was just anything that looked overheated, we just took it out, and just let the facts and data speak for themselves about what's going on.
Yeah. What in a nutshell, like what are some of the facts that we can let people know that, hey, this is where the reality that we're dealing with now, because so often people will when they hear this, that whites are racist, they think, oh, that's not true. How could you possibly say this? And it comes at you with all this like CRT, and diversity. It just all
Right.
gets just thrown at you, and because there's so much indoctrination, it's almost like for you to interpret that these facts as whites are discriminated, even that alone is racism. So
Right. Right.
like what are the facts that we can point people to and hopefully say, hey, look at the facts and make the judgment yourself, but this is where it lines up with.
Right. Well, I mean, ultimately, that's what my book is about. I mean, I'll just kind of lay out the basic structure of the book, and maybe I can kind of highlight a couple things. I mean, it's hard because I've got almost 1,000 references
Wow.
in the book, so it's like, okay, well, I'll pick a couple. But I sort of walk up by giving what I see as a sort of lay of the land, and then I get into a discussion of civil rights law and its history, because even though there are other people who've written books in a kind of narrower but somewhat similar vein recently, who focus kind of almost exclusively, they just talk about civil rights law. And I think civil rights law is an important part of this story, but it's not by any means all of this story. And if you made some of the dubious parts of civil rights law today go away, I actually think you would solve, unfortunately, fewer problems than a lot of people think that you would solve. But I do that. And then I get into 12 sort of subject matter chapters. And those range from the church to looking at crime, to looking at Hollywood, to looking at big business, healthcare, the military, you name it. And I sort of examine how anti-white discrimination or racism plays out in those contexts. And then I finally kind of have a chapter where I say, well, okay, this is all great. So why is this happening, right? Especially in a country where white people are still in a narrow majority, you wouldn't expect this to be happening. So like, what's driving it? Who's driving it? Why isn't nobody doing anything about it? And then I kind of have some ways to go forward. But I mean, I think, again, if you look at things like, again, the way things have gone in the church, where, by the way, of course, we were not, as I don't need to tell you, I mean, we weren't free of the opposite side of the church discrimination in the past. And it's kind of interesting. I mean, we shouldn't expect the church being filled with sinners right from the pastor on down. It shouldn't surprise us that the church has failed on this issue in opposite ways before, right? When it was when it was trendy to be an anti-minority racist, often the church, failed in that regard 70 years ago. So I mean, and of course, when I say the church, I'm not suggesting every pastor, much less
Yeah.
every parishioner, right? But I'm just saying institutionally, it shouldn't surprise us as Christians at all that we're finding this sort of rot within the church. In fact, it would be a stunning kind of repudiation of original sin for us not to find these sorts of things in the church. But so you have that going on there. I talk a lot about crime and how the narrative on crime is kind of exactly the opposite of what you'd think, and that, of course, to the extent that we do have interracial crime, which I should hasten to say is not the majority of crime at all. In fact, it's a small minority, but it's the exact opposite of the way it's sort of portrayed in the media. And the number of unarmed African
Mm.
Americans, for example, being killed by police officers is usually less than about 10 per year, as opposed to the thousands that you would go if you were to ask particularly folks on the left. In business, I kind of document all sorts of anti-white quotas that are going on, often in blatant violation of the law. Healthcare, similarly, talking about how everything from medical school admissions to even the sequence with which we can get life-saving medicines is often now determined by race. And so that's kind of the structure of the book.
Do you find, like, when you quote this data to people, what's the average response that you get? Like, are you met with a lot of pushback and, like, just kind of, almost like, what I realized too is that people seem to think that because whites are controlling America
Yeah,
and, they're the ones in power, they have the privilege, that it's almost like it's okay to be racist towards them
yeah,
because, they got enough of privilege anyway. So, we can't be racist towards any other people, but we can afford, and you get a get out of jail free card to
right.
discriminate white people. Is that a response that you kind of find in the
Yeah,
literature?
well, so this is a really interesting question that you've just asked, and let me kind of break it down from a couple different ways. I should say right now, I mean, the book has sold super well, which I feel super blessed about. I mean,
Yeah, it's great.
it sold, it just, even in the first week of sales, I probably sold about as many copies as I was hoping to sell. Not hoping, but the kind of low end of hoping for my first year, just to give
Wow,
you a
that's
sense.
awesome.
So,
Yeah,
so the book, and the book has stayed selling really well. So
good.
that's been great. So I mean, I think it
Yeah,
shows there's a lot of interest in the subject. Um, but I think it's still primarily being sold to people who are at least open to the argument or sympathetic to the argument, which is not surprising, right? I think the challenge, I would love to have that conversation more with people who are more skeptical, right? And I haven't had as many of those, at least about the book. I mean, of course, I've had the conversation about the issue with people, but I think it's different when I'm saying, okay, well, here I've laid this out in a very systematic way in the book, and you've read the book. Like, let's talk about what you find plausible here and not plausible. So I'm looking forward. I mean, the book has still been out less than a month.
mm,
I'm looking forward to having more of those conversations as it kind of percolates out a little
yeah,
wider in the political sphere. The second thing you talk about, I think, is really interesting, which is there's a perception that, like, well, whites have all the power and therefore it's okay that we can do that. And it's interesting
yeah,
because in many ways, even that kind of framing of it is somewhat discriminatory and not really in line with reality. It's one of the things I show in the book. First of all the kind of white privilege arguments tend to erase Asian Americans. So Asian Americans have I mean, not for every single Asian subgroup, but for the vast majority of them, higher income, better education, better health outcomes,
mm,
all the sorts of things that you would associate with having a good life, at least from a data perspective. Asian Americans outscore whites in America. And, uh, that kind of has to be erased. But I show that it's not just Asian Americans. I mean, if you look at, like, Cuban Americans and Venezuelan Americans or Igbo Nigerian Americans, et cetera. Like, if you go down the line, you find that white people are not standing up quite as well as you might think. And in fact, you even sort of see a situation in which there's a Nobel Prize winning economist at Princeton named Angus Deaton and his wife Ann Case, who have done work on what's so-called deaths of despair. And what they find is you have a rise among white American middle-aged and kind of lower elderly people of drug overdoses, suicides, alcohol related deaths, the sorts of things that we tend to associate with kind of vast angst, right?
Yeah.
And so you're seeing this sort of thing going on, and so even the reality of somehow white people kind of being on the top of the heap. I mean, maybe this describes America 40 years ago, also pre a lot of immigration. It certainly doesn't really accurately describe America today.
Yes. Definitely. You talked about, how you have Acts 29 and Gospel Coalition in your book, which I'm happy for.
Yeah.
So, would you say it's kind of like 50-50 as far as how America has gotten to this place? It's not just in the political side that has taken over and say we got to be discriminatory towards or racist towards white people. It was also, institutions like the Gospel Coalitions and churches as
Yeah.
well who are pushing this agenda where it's like they bring in what the culture brings in and they preach it and teach it. And from my point of view too, I tend to think that that's really where all the power tends to go in the pastors and teachers, because if you have the state teaching the congregants white people are racist, and you go to Sunday morning and your pastor who loves Tim Keller and Matt Chandler and Gospel Coalition, he's doing it.
Yeah.
It's like now you got this political side, but more importantly, you have this spiritual side where it's like, I want to be on the side of Jesus. So if I'm white, I'll hate my whiteness. And
Right.
if you're white, I'll put you in the same bracket where I'll hate your whiteness.
Yeah, no, I think this is absolutely going on, right? That the churches and other para non-official institutions of all types are reinforcing the message that we're getting from government schools, from the government itself, from the media. And so that's very unhelpful. And again, I mean, I want to stretch this isn't everything. I mean, in the book, I sort of, at first, I pick a lot on like the Congregationalists and the Episcopalians and
Mm,
the PCUSA. And I say, look, I mean, I do this. I just show how completely absurd. Like your readers, if they go out and buy this book, I mean, they won't even believe some of the stuff that is going on in these denominations. And I should sort of suggest that this is important. I mean, often this is actually not happening at the congregational level. So, I mean, some of it's like tuned down 80% of the congregational level because all of the congregants of these places tend to be old and white.
yeah.
So they don't say it as much in the church, but in terms of the official denominational positions, the organization, etc. I mean, it's like reading a Black Lives Matter manifesto from 2020. I'm literally not kidding. And I think the reason why it's important, even if it's not filtering down unfiltered into the church, is that that's still speaking a lot to where the leadership and the activism are of these churches. But I also say, look, I mean, going after mainline Protestants, there are believers there, of course, within those churches, among the pastors, et
Oh
cetera.
yeah.
But it's kind of shooting fish at a barrel at the same time. It's like, I mean, those guys have, forgive me, like they've kind of lost the plot, as the Brits would say, in so many ways that to kind of really focus on the main line is like, okay, I could have written an easy entire chapter on that. Where I think it's really interesting and sort of more sobering is to go into the real Bible believing churches. Churches like my own, the Presbyterian Church in America, other kind of conservative, non-denominational Protestant denominations, whatever have you, and see that this type of thinking has a lot. And I think it has a lot to do, again, with the kind of, again, I don't want to get too much over my skis in terms of theology and church history, but to me, it's a little bit of this seeker sensitive model, again, on steroids, right? It's like, okay, well, what are
Oh
people
yeah.
looking for? As opposed to here's the gospel truth, whether or not it makes you comfortable, whether or not it's what the culture is saying. That's what I'm going to say.
How do you think we're doing now as far as like white racism being a major problem? Do you think that more people are waking up? I mean, it seems to be that way where people are kind of realizing wokeness is dead. You see, like Acts 29 is dying, Gospel Coalition it really isn't that famous anymore, and
Yeah.
the credibility goes down. So do you think like over the next couple of years this is kind of going to go down, or do you think it's going to stay level or go up?
Yeah. Well, I have to say, I started writing this book almost 2 years ago and had thought
Okay.
about writing it for quite some time before then. And I think one of the encouraging things is when I started writing this book, sometimes I was like, whoa, like on the narrow tightrope here. And as I've gone along, I feel like I've published this at a time when, look, it's still only pretty conservative people who will talk about this, but they are, some of our mainstream figures, guys like Tucker Carlson and Charlie Kirk, who both endorsed the book and had me on their shows, or Matt Walsh,
Yeah.
major. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's huge, by the way. Their endorsements.
Yeah,
That's
yeah, no,
awesome.
I had a lot of good endorsements, and then and then folks like even in the church, although I know he's kind of a little controversial in various forms, but a guy even like Rod Dreher, who's kind of in and back, was another guy who endorsed the book, and then I've had tremendous support from guys like Stephen Wolfe and from kind of the Christian nationalist world, if I'm allowed to talk
Yeah.
about that here.
Yeah, you
So I mean, I
can.
think among at least conservative Christians, there's a lot of openness to talking about this, and also just I think among secular people there is an opening to talk about this, and that's really encouraging. And in fact, I'm going to sit down with quite a number of members of Congress and talk about this at
Really?
some point. Yes, I'll be a little vague
Wow.
on that,
Praise
but
God.
yes, I think people do realize it. People are willing to talk about it. Um, Even though, yes, the left is still going to scream racist, but I think we are more willing to kind of tune that out, right? It ultimately, like, it matters just as much what we're answering to as what they're calling us. And so I think the environment has gotten better. At the same time, and my friends, like my friend Chris Rufo, who was another endorser of the book and was kind of the guy who put critical race theory on the map and killed it in Virginia, and has been, I think, the most effective, or not. I mean, he's been the single most effective person politically on these issues in the entire country.
Hmm.
Um, but I do think we're in a little bit of a ratchet situation where it's like the left had gone so far, nobody had pushed back on them. Finally, the right, as we often do, kind of woke up and began to push back, but they've just kind of turned back the ratchet. So they've realized they got a little out of their over their skis, just given where power dynamics were on some of this stuff. So they're doing a temporary strategic retreat, but
Hmm.
in no way do I think wokeness has peaked, that this is going to go away. It's only going to go away when we meet their power with the power of God, backed by our own steadfastness. That's
Yes.
what's going to fix it.
Yeah, I kind of see that too. Where and even with the pastors around my area, they kind of sense that that people were a little waking up and like they were really ruffling a lot of feathers, and people were leaving their churches. So it's kind of like I'll be more implicit about it. I won't be so upfront to you. I'll dial it down. I'll be more nuanced. That's the favorite term that they love to use.
Yeah,
But I at the same time I don't trust them, and I
yeah.
also realize, well, these people, they preached all this, but all of a sudden they just stopped, but they never publicly repented. So it makes me think and still hold them in the same bracket as if, okay, they're still woke, or they're still in favor of this. They're just pushing back, like you said, and I'm sure if another 2020 happens, they're going to be right there where they were again.
Right. And so the goal for us is to not be where we were again. I mean, I was one of those people. I was one of the few. In fact, the first time I ever went on Tucker Carlson was because I was one of the few who, at the peak of George Floyd mania, was calling, absolutely no way on any of this stuff in a very public fashion. But I think they are going to fall back into their old ways, their old sinful ways, if we don't call them to account. And you see this again. I have a quote in the book from the guy who is now, I think he's maybe chancellor at Biola University, but he was at the time the head of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And at
Mm.
the peak of George Floyd mania, he was saying things like, I'm going to be a racist until I die, and I'm resurrected in my glorified body. And I'm like, well, if you're a racist, you're probably not the right person to be running the Southern Baptist Coalition's, seminary, right? And of course, right, like, he's not really saying that, right? It's a performative thing
Yeah.
to kind of show really how virtuous he is, which is sinful on any number of levels, right?
Yes.
But that's what you have going on. And this guy did get enough pushback that eventually this is still being fought, a lot of these CRT issues within the Southern Baptist Convention. But he sort of left for this other position. But there wasn't any real accountability for what he did or what he
Yeah.
said. So
What do you think that we can do better? Because like I'm of the same mind too. That what happened again is going to happen. I don't know, whether it's 2 years or 4 years, but it's going to happen again probably in our lifetime. So what are you thinking we can do better?
Yeah, well, one of the things I say a little bit in the book, and when I try to get this question in interviews, I try to be a little more explicit about it, which is I wrote this book for everybody. Absolutely. I did not absolutely just write this book just for white people or even white conservatives or whatever have you. Having said that, um, it's a little bit, I'm not trying to whine to the refs here. I'm not trying to say, like, let's have a new victim class called white people. I'm trying to say, hey, white people, let's have enough self respect that we get up off the canvas and say, we're not going to allow ourselves to be treated in this way, right? Like,
Mm,
we value ourselves enough, we believe in our equal rights enough that this nonsense is going to stop. So it's kind of a truly a rally the troops type thing. It's to really put forth in a non dogmatic, non histrionic, non polemical way a bunch of facts that will really arm somebody who kind of maybe has a sort of vague sense that this is going on and that it's not right, but they lack the facts and background and theoretical framework for to talk about it and to
yeah.
advocate. They lack a book where they can go to their city council and like wave it at their woke representative there and say, you need to read this book or read from it. So I think that we need to arm ourselves with both courage and information. And I obviously can't give anybody else courage. That's got to be a personal thing on their part, but at least I can provide the information with which they can back their own courage.
So you don't want to make a social justice for white people, is what
Right.
you're saying. Yeah. So we
Right.
don't want to be like them.
Now, this is a very, very subtle point, actually. And so I want to be really clear about how I talk
Okay.
about it, because there's another thing that I'm also not trying to do, which is to say, oh, well, I don't, there's a whole, we don't want to, we don't see color, et cetera. I think that's unrealistic. I think what we want to do is have a legal system that is, to the greatest possible extent, colorblind. But the way that we get to that type of legal system is not to have a sort of thing, which is what we kind of have now, where the left makes these racialist demands and they organize racially. And the white response is to kind of make these gauzy statements about colorblind equality and et cetera, et cetera. And we just get steamrolled.
Mhm.
So, in the same way that Martin Luther King Jr. organized during the civil rights, he wasn't organizing like random people on the street. He's like, it's African Americans, my group that is being discriminated against. I'm organizing them as African Americans. I'm going to bring in allied whites and other groups to work with us on that. But we're not going to pretend that there's no racial dynamic to what's going on now. So I think that whites need to get over the idea that we can't organize as white people. It's a question of what are we organizing for? Are we
Hmm.
organizing for some sort of special rights for whites? No. But what we are going to do, need to organize as a group with other allied non-white people to say, if you hit us in this way, if you continue to discriminate against us, if this type of racist behavior continues, there's going to be a very painful pushback, blowback to you, such that you're going to decide, hey, you know what, maybe this is just not the right way to go about things politically if you
Yeah.
lack the conscience to just kind of do it on your own. And so that is the kind of middle ground that I'm trying to stake out in this particular debate.
So yeah, going back to your first title draft, it's okay to be white. Like, are you saying like, kind of like how conservatives, do fire back with that,
Yeah.
rhetoric. Like, I don't see color, I just see character. You're basically saying, well, it's okay to say, hey, whites fit into this bracket, and they
Yeah.
have even like these cultural norms that
Yeah.
and everybody else does it. Like we have Italian food, Italian cities, Italian
Sure.
culture. Like that's okay.
Like, I guess, yeah. My point is, like, white people, there should be no tactic that is available to other groups of people that is not available to white people by version because they happen to have a certain color of skin.
Very
Right
important.
now,
Yes.
again, where do I want us to head? It's not in some sort of world of racial preferences for whites. It's in a world where, as much as possible, we are taking race out of those sorts of political calculations. Now, again, where it gets a little subtle, and I talk about this in the book, is we do have a culture and history that is largely European derived. I mean, I'm oversimplifying to say that, but it's
Yeah.
not a dramatic oversimplification. And I don't think that we can erase that. I have an entire chapter, in fact, on history in the book and how we're erasing it. So we are going to do some things that, even when we kind of treat them in a quote unquote unbiased way, are maybe going to look like, well, like whites come out, more important in this particular way that we're talking about it. So I'm not suggesting that that type of thing can't happen, because it's just the reality of our culture in history, and not kind of saying that that history was terrible or trying to erase it. But I am suggesting that kind of fundamentally, when we talk about legal things, certainly where we want to do is to get to a point where we're not, you know, giving preferences on race, understanding that people are going to see color, and that's inevitable. It's like expecting people not to sin, right? To say, oh, you're not ever going to see color. The question is, like, once we see it, what do we do about that, right?
Mm.
And I'm suggesting that we treat everybody as equally as possible. And if we see things where we're discriminating against somebody based on the color of their skin, that we call it out, no matter who that's happening to, without apology.
Wow. Yes. Amen. When you go before Congress, is this going to also be addressing issues of immigration? Because I know you talk about this in the book as well.
Yeah, I
Okay.
should stress I'm not going before Congress. I'm speaking to congressmen. I mean,
Oh, I'm
I mean,
sorry.
I may go before Congress at some point. That's not.
Okay.
I mean, I'm talking to staffers and things like that. But um, uh, you'd sort of asked. I'm sorry, just I lost the train of thought.
Oh, yeah. So is this
The
going to be
immigration piece.
also, yeah, yeah, immigration? Because,
Yeah.
like, there's a chapter in your book on this.
Yeah. So of all these different areas, this is a survey course very much, and I say that in the book, right? So I'm covering a huge variety of different areas, not all of which I'm expert in, all of which I'm knowledgeable in. And if I was not an expert in it, I went and I got, as I did for my church chapter, I went and I got a reviewer inside those worlds, really taking part of these things to kind of like, hey, can you reality check this for me, make sure it makes sense. Immigration is probably the area that I am most expert in of all the areas that I wrote
Oh,
about.
wow.
It's something I've written a lot about in the past over a number of years, and so very aware of it. And I think this is the other area where I may be saying, this is why I'm not kind of just saying colorblind, 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 because I think the very non-colorblind erasure of kind of America's white majority that's happened since the Hart-Celler Immigration Act of 1965 is not something that we should just sort of pretend is not going on. So one of the things I kind of explore within the book, I kind of walk through an entire immigration history of America. Obviously, it's a thumbnail sketch, but honestly, the vast majority of people only have kind of propaganda on this issue. And so I think getting a more nuanced and realistic immigration history, including understanding where the phrase like a nation of immigrants comes from, which it's kind of created out of whole cloth by John F. Kennedy as an adjunct to his presidential campaign in 1960. Before then,
Mm.
we didn't really have that type of conception of ourselves as a country. So I do talk about that a lot. And I talk about how the sorts of immigration that we've had since the Hart-Celler Act of 1965 that gave us our modern Immigration Act is really unprecedented and a dramatic departure from anything that we'd done in the previous 350 years of immigration we'd had largely from Europe to the US. And so I kind of get into some of the myths around immigration. And one of the things I say in my conclusions of my book is that until we both deport all illegal immigrants and get control of our border, it's going to be very hard to solve any of these issues longer term and to recohere an American identity around the multi-ethnic community that we have here now. And that's, by the way, that's not going to change just because we start kicking out illegal aliens. We're still
Yeah.
going to be a multi-ethnic polity. So the question is, how do we move forward best based on that reality?
Yeah, boy, isn't that true? People often think like if we stop immigration, like it's just going to be 100% white people. Like,
Yeah,
no, we still have non-white people in this country, and
yeah,
and that's what we're asking for. We're just asking for law and order. I don't know if that's the lines that you were going,
yeah,
along, but wow.
yeah. Well, certainly. I mean, we've got to follow the law, and I mean, we've got a place. I mean, I don't say anything even close to this overwrought within the book, but I mean, look, I mean, what Joe Biden is doing right now in immigration, like it borders right up against treason, right? Like he's blatantly defying
Yeah,
the law. He understands that he's defying the law, both in letter and in spirit. He's allowing this immigration um, invasion to basically happen unchecked. And again, what's happened under Biden, as bad as it was under Obama, is Trump improved it quite a bit, but it's Biden is an order of magnitude worse. I mean, and so if you've got one political party that is doing that, it's really hard to kind of, I mean, that's maybe one of my most, as the internet guys would say, black pilled observations within this book is like, well, what do you do about that? I mean, it used to be at least the Democrats, maybe, yeah, they were letting in a bunch of illegals, but they pretended that they thought that was a really bad thing. Now they're just subsidizing it. And by the way, guess who the number one implementer of a lot of this stuff is? It's church groups. So
It's so true.
yeah.
Yeah. So hopefully,
Catholic charities, various Protestant groups involved, and it's a money machine. I mean, it's not based on some sort of command for Jesus. If you took away the money in this, that would disappear for the vast majority of the churches.
wow. Yeah. What a shame.
Yeah.
I know you're a busy man, but any final words of encouragement that you want to give to us for our
Yeah.
audience?
I mean, as I talk about in the book, I think this is not an unsolvable problem. Okay. It's not an easy to solve problem. I walk through some of the ways that we can solve it. And I think that these are doable things. I think there's certainly a lot preferable to the alternative, which is some sort of violent civil conflict that we might kind of end up in because we've got a really fractious multi-ethnic democracy. And the history of multi-ethnic democracies is not a great one, just frankly, throughout the world. So I think the good news is we've handled even stiffer challenges as a country before. We can do it. I mean, ultimately, God is in control of what happens regardless. And so that can kind of, that's if I ever get too worked up, I always just remind myself of that and relax.
Yeah.
But we can speak up for ourselves. There are ways to get around this. If people read the book, I think they'll be impressed by what they see. If they're interested in anything I'm saying, they can go to my Twitter/X handle, which is Real Jeremy Carl. I tweet about things a lot there. I also have a Substack called The Course of Empire, where I tweet or where I put out a lot of stuff that I'm doing. And then again, I'd say hopefully your listeners in listening to this, they're like, wow, this guy sounds great. I want to go out and get the book. But even if you're like, well, I don't know about these things that he's saying, but I think this is an important issue. If you go out and purchase a copy of the book, you will not make me rich. If you know anything about the publishing world, sadly, authors just get a few bucks for each of those nice hardcovers that you're getting. But what you do is send a message to publishers that this is an important subject. I was really fortunate to get a mainstream conservative publisher to take on this book. But it sends a message that like, hey, the market is interested in this, and then other people will come along and hopefully write even better books than mine. That's without my goal. I don't have any pride of ownership of these ideas.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to make a better country. So that's why I'm talking to folks like you, and I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, definitely. Pleasure's all mine. And I'll include your book in the description of this video. So to the audience, please go purchase it. Like I said, it does help, and it sends a message. It's like liking this video that gets the algorithm saying, "Hey, let's put this out in front of more people." So buy his book and like this video, share it.
Yeah.
And
at least like the video, right? That's free to you. I mean, even if you don't, if you can't scrape together even $15 for a Kindle or 27 for a hardback, liking the video is free, and that helps.
Amen. Well, thank you so much, for your work, and and God bless you too, with all the stuff that you're doing and all the podcasts and interviews that you're going on, because a lot of them are very important. Like I can tell.
Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate you having me on.
My pleasure. All right, guys, take care and God bless.